A night of fate. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Starlight Pavilion, the annual charity gala was in full swing. Laughter and the sound of crystal glasses clinking together filled the air. It was an event where the city's wealthiest elite gathered, a celebration of influence and generosity. Dressed in their finest attire, guests indulged in gourmet cuisine and discussed high-stakes business deals, all while donating millions to causes that promised change. At the heart of it all stood James Parker, a billionaire attorney and self-made man. With a sharp navy suit tailored to perfection, he exuded confidence and authority. He was the type of man who commanded attention without asking for it. Tonight, however, he was more than just a guest. He was the keynote speaker, the star of the evening. As he scanned the crowd, his gaze landed on Olivia Harper, a well-known socialite who had been one of his closest friends since law school. Dressed in an elegant silver gown, she waved at him across the room. "James, over here," she called, her sequins shimmering under the soft lighting. James smiled and made his way over. "Olivia, you look stunning." "As always." She laughed, tossing her blonde curls over one shoulder. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Parker." She leaned in conspiratorially. "So, are you ready for your big speech?" James sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "I've given 100 speeches, Olivia. But tonight feels different." "Because it's personal," she said knowingly. He nodded. She was right. This wasn't just about donations. It was about something deeper, something close to his heart. Giving back to the children who needed it most. Before they could continue, the event organizer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? We are about to hear from our esteemed guest, Mr. James Parker. Let's give him a warm welcome." Thunderous applause erupted as James made his way to the stage. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself and stepped forward. "Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to stand before you tonight," he began, his voice clear and unwavering. "When I look at this room, I see power, influence, the ability to change lives. And I ask you, what is wealth, if not the ability to uplift others?" He let the question settle in the room before continuing. "My passion for this cause stems from someone very dear to me. My sister, Chloe. She had a heart that saw potential in everyone. She believed in lifting others up, even when she had nothing herself." He hesitated briefly, emotions rising in his throat. "But Chloe disappeared from my life many years ago. I don't know where she is now, or if she's even alive. All I know is that she wanted the world to be a better place, and in her memory, I intend to make that happen." The crowd sat in silence, moved by his words. Then, applause. Warm, genuine applause. James gave a small nod of gratitude and stepped down from the stage. But as he walked back into the sea of well-dressed guests, his eyes caught sight of a small figure standing at the edge of the room. A little girl, no older than 6, clutching a well-loved teddy bear. Her large hazel eyes were fixed on him with an expression of curiosity. She was completely out of place in this lavish event. James frowned. Who was she? And more importantly, how did she get in? Curious, he approached her and knelt down to her level. "Hey there," he said gently. The girl clutched her teddy bear tighter. "Hi, sir. What's your name?" "Lily." "Well, it's nice to meet you, Lily." James smiled, but something about her expression struck a deep chord in him. "Are you here with someone?" She nodded. "My mommy's working." James raised an eyebrow. "Working?" There were only staff and wealthy guests at this event. Then, to his complete shock, Lily pointed at the ring on his hand and said, "My mommy has a ring just like yours." James froze. His pulse pounded in his ears. His ring wasn't just any ring. It was a family heirloom, passed down for generations, but he had given its twin to only one person. "Chloe." His breath caught. "Your mommy has a ring like mine." He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, It has a blue stone. She never takes it off. She says it's special, like magic. James's world tilted on its axis. That was Chloe's ring. He knew it without a doubt. Lily, what's your mommy's name? He asked carefully. Sarah. The name didn't ring a bell, but his heart raced with a mix of emotions: hope, confusion, disbelief. Where does she work? At the hospital. She helps people get better. Sometimes she says she wishes we had more money to help others. James exhaled shakily. This was too much of a coincidence. The ring, the hospital, the fact that Lily had somehow ended up at this event. It wasn't random. It was fate. He placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. Lily, can you take me to meet your mommy? She grinned. Sure, she's coming home soon. You can come too. James's heart pounded as he stood. He wasn't sure what he was about to walk into. But deep down, he knew this was the moment that would change everything. As they walked toward the exit, James glanced at Lily, his mind racing. Was Sarah his sister? Had she been hiding all these years? Or was there something even bigger at play? The answers lay ahead, and James was ready to face them. Shadows of the past. James Parker sat in the back seat of his sleek black limousine, his mind a storm of thoughts. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but he barely noticed. His focus remained on the little girl sitting beside him. Lily, the child who had unknowingly cracked open the locked doors of his past. She swung her small legs as she clutched her teddy bear, humming softly to herself, completely at ease, completely unaware of the turmoil unraveling inside him. James inhaled sharply. Sarah. That was the name Lily had given him. A stranger. A woman he had never met before. And yet, she had Chloe's ring. His grip tightened around the steering wheel of his thoughts. If this woman was connected to his sister, why had she never come forward? Had Chloe given her the ring? Was she still alive? He exhaled slowly. Patience, James. One step at a time. Lily suddenly turned to him, her eyes bright. You're really quiet, Mr. James. He forced a smile. Just thinking. About what? He hesitated before answering. About your mommy. I think she might be someone very important to me. Lily tilted her head. You know my mommy. James hesitated again, then said, I'm not sure yet, but I'd really like to meet her. Lily beamed. She's the best. She always makes me soup when I'm sick and reads me bedtime stories. She's a really good nurse, too. She helps people every day. James swallowed the lump in his throat. The more he learned about Sarah, the more questions filled his mind. Who was she to Chloe? Why did she have that ring? The car slowed as they approached a quiet suburban neighborhood. The buildings here were nothing like the towering penthouses James was used to. Instead, they were small, cozy homes, modest but well-kept. The streetlights cast a soft glow, illuminating a humble apartment complex at the end of the street. This is it. Lily chirped as the limo pulled up. James stepped out, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. This place, it felt strangely familiar. Lily tugged his sleeve. Come on. Mommy's home. His pulse quickened as they approached the door of apartment 6B. Lily fumbled with the keys before pushing the door open. Inside, the space was simple but warm. Worn-out furniture, a few picture frames on the walls, and a lingering scent of lavender. It wasn't much, but it felt like home. A woman stood in the small kitchen, her back turned to them. She wore blue medical scrubs, her hair tied in a loose bun. Monty, I brought a friend. Lily called out excitedly. The woman turned around, and James felt the world tilt beneath his feet. She was beautiful, but not in a flashy way. She had soft brown hair, kind hazel eyes, and a tired but gentle smile. But it wasn't her beauty that stunned him. It was the shock in her expression when she saw him. She knew who he was. James Parker, she whispered, her voice barely audible. James stepped forward, his pulse roaring in his ears. Sarah. A long silence stretched between them. Lily, oblivious to the tension, smiled proudly. "Monty, Mr. James is really nice. He said he knows you." Sarah's expression flickered with an emotion James couldn't quite place. Fear, recognition, guilt. She swallowed hard. "Lily, sweetheart, why don't you go wash up before bed?" "But..." "Now, Lily." Lily pouted but obeyed, skipping off down the hallway. The moment she disappeared, Sarah turned back to James, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" she asked. James crossed his arms, his voice calm but firm. "That's what I'd like to ask you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his ring, holding it up. "Lily told me you have one just like this." Sarah's eyes flickered with something. Panic. Pain. But she didn't deny it. James stepped closer. "That ring was my sister's. Chloe." Sarah took a shaky breath. "I know." His heart stopped. "You?" "No." A long silence followed. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment before saying, "James, there's something you need to know." He clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Then tell me." Sarah exhaled sharply. She walked over to the small coffee table and picked up a worn-out wooden box. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing the ring. James's breath caught. It was identical to his. A lump formed in his throat. He reached out, his fingers brushing over the familiar blue stone. "Where did you get this?" Sarah hesitated. Then she finally said the words that changed everything. "James, your sister was my best friend. Chloe gave this ring to me before she disappeared." The words sent a shockwave through James's entire body. His worst fear and greatest hope collided at once. Chloe. She had been alive. She had been here. And Sarah. Sarah had known all along. James's eyes darkened. "You knew her, and you never told me." Sarah flinched. "I didn't know how to. I didn't think you'd understand." Chloe. She was running from something. James's stomach twisted. Running from what? Sarah bit her lip. Then she whispered the last thing he expected to hear. "From your father." A cold chill swept through James's body. The past he had tried to bury was being ripped open all over again. He staggered backward, running a hand through his hair. "No, that's not possible. She would have told me." "She didn't want you to know," Sarah said softly. "She thought, if you found out, he'd come after you too." James's fists clenched. He had spent years trying to erase the memory of his father, the man who had ruled their home with an iron fist, a man who never let anyone escape his control. But Chloe had escaped, and in doing so, she had vanished from his life. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Where is she, Sarah?" Sarah hesitated. I don't know." James's world tilted again. "What do you mean you don't know? You just said you were friends." Sarah's voice broke. "She left James years ago, and she made me promise not to look for her." James staggered back, shaking his head. She was out there, somewhere. For the first time in years, hope and fury warred inside him. He turned to Sarah, his voice like steel. "I'm going to find her." Sarah looked at him with sad eyes. "And what if she doesn't want to be found?" James stared at her, his jaw set. "I don't care," he said. "She's my sister, and I'm not losing her again." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Then you're going to need my help." James's gaze locked onto hers. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was a war against everything that had kept Chloe hidden, and James was ready to fight. The secrets we bury. James Parker sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what Sarah had just revealed. Chloe had been running, not from life, not from a mistake, from their father. He felt like the walls around him were closing in. The air in Sarah's modest apartment suddenly felt too thick, suffocating. It was as if years of buried memories had been dug up and thrown at him all at once. The abuse, the control, The fear. For so long, he had believed that Chloe had just vanished, that something terrible had happened to her. He had blamed himself for not protecting her. But now he knew the truth. She had been trying to protect him. His hands curled into fists on the table. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low but vibrating with barely contained fury. Sarah flinched at the coldness in his tone. "I wanted to. But Chloe made me promise." James let out a bitter laugh. "She made you promise? What about me, Sarah? Do you know what it's like to think your own sister is dead? To spend years searching, only to find out she was alive, and no one told me." Sarah's face was filled with regret. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Chloe had her reasons. She was scared." James inhaled deeply, trying to calm himself, but it wasn't working. His emotions were a tangled mess. Anger, confusion, betrayal, relief, all of it colliding in his chest. Lily suddenly peeked her head into the room, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Mommy, is everything okay?" Sarah immediately softened. "Yes, sweetheart. Go back to bed. Okay." Lily nodded, but before she left, she turned to James and smiled. "I'm happy you're here." James felt his heart squeeze at her innocent words. He forced a small smile. "Me too, kiddo." When she was gone, James ran a hand down his face and exhaled. "I need answers, Sarah, and I'm not leaving until I get them." Sarah sighed, nodding. "All right, let's talk." The ghosts of the past. They moved to the small couch in the living room. The place was humble, but it had warmth, something James's childhood home never had. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. "You and Chloe, you were close, weren't you?" James scoffed. "More than close. She was my best friend. She practically raised me after my mom died. She was always looking out for me." Sarah gave a sad smile. "That sounds like her." James leaned forward. "Tell me everything, Sarah. Start from the beginning." Sarah took a deep breath before she began. "I met Chloe about 10 years ago. She was going by the name Elena Carter then. I was in my first year of nursing school, and she worked at a small bookshop in a quiet town 2 states away. She was different from the other girls. She never talked about her past, never got too close to anyone. But she was kind, always looking out for others. We became friends pretty quickly. She was like a sister to me. But even then, I knew she was hiding something. One night, I found her in her apartment, sitting by the window, crying. She never cried in front of people, James. But that night, she told me everything. She told me about your father, about the abuse, the way he tried to control both of you, and how she was terrified that if he ever found her, he would drag her back." James clenched his jaw. "That bastard." Sarah nodded. "She didn't tell me everything, but I knew enough. Enough to know she was broken inside. She told me she had to disappear because if she stayed, he'd come for her. And worse, he'd come for you." James swallowed hard. "She never stopped thinking about you," Sarah continued. "She worried about you all the time, but she thought you were better off without her." James shook his head, his voice raw. "That's not true. I needed her." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "I know." For a moment, they sat there in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Then James asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment he saw the ring. "Why did she leave you, Sarah?" Sarah's expression turned pained. She was scared. One day, she showed up at my door, trembling. She said someone had been asking about her, someone who knew her real name. She panicked. She packed up and disappeared that night. That was 6 years ago. I haven't seen her since." James inhaled sharply. 6 years. 6 years of silence. 6 years where she had been alone. 6 years where he could have found her. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room. "We have to find her, Sarah. I have to find her." Sarah nodded. "I was afraid to look for her before. But if you're in this, Then I'll help you. James turned to her, determination burning in his eyes. Then let's start now. The first clue. Sarah disappeared into her bedroom and came back holding a small envelope. This was the last thing she ever gave me, she said, handing it to James. James hesitated before opening it. Inside was a faded photograph of Chloe, standing in front of a diner. On the back, scrawled in her familiar handwriting, was a single sentence. If anything happens, find me here. James's hands trembled. A location. Hope surged inside him like wildfire. Sarah was watching him closely. Do you know that place? James nodded slowly. I think I do. It was an old seaside town, far from the city. A place Chloe had once talked about, back when they were kids. She had always dreamed of escaping there. And now, it might just be where she was hiding. James turned to Sarah, his expression firm. We're going there. Tomorrow. Sarah's eyes widened. James, what if? No what ifs, he interrupted. I've spent too long living with questions and regrets. It's time for answers. Sarah exhaled, but nodded. All right. We'll go. James glanced down at the photograph again, his heart pounding with anticipation. After years of searching, years of wondering, he finally had a lead. And nothing, not even the ghosts of their past, was going to stop him from finding his sister. The road to redemption. The night stretched long, the weight of old wounds pressing down on James Parker as he stood by the window of his penthouse apartment. The view of the city skyline, usually a source of pride, felt hollow tonight. The twinkling lights below blurred in his vision as his mind replayed Sarah's words. Chloe's fear, the last trace of her existence tucked in that faded photograph. If anything happens, find me here. The words on the back of the picture had become his new obsession. A diner. A place she had once dreamed of. Could she really be there? Was it possible after all these years? James exhaled sharply and turned away from the window. He had spent his entire adult life burying the past, building an empire to shield himself from the pain of his childhood. But now, the walls he had so carefully constructed were collapsing, and he was ready to face what lay beyond them. A journey into the unknown. The next morning, James pulled up in front of Sarah's modest apartment in his sleek black Aston Martin, the engine purring quietly. He wasn't sure if she'd actually come with him. She had been reluctant the night before, scared, hesitant, burdened by her own ghosts. But as he stepped out, she was already waiting for him at the curb, Lily clinging to her leg. You're really going, huh? Sarah asked, tightening her grip on Lily's small hand. James nodded. I have to. Sarah studied his face for a long moment before sighing. Then I'm coming too. James raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? No, she admitted. But if there's a chance Chloe is still out there, I need to know. Lily tugged on Sarah's sleeve. Mommy, where are you going? Sarah bent down to meet her daughter's eyes. I have to help Mr. James find someone very special, sweetheart. But don't worry, you'll be safe with Mrs. Callahan. Lily's lip wobbled. Will you come back? Sarah pulled her into a tight hug. Always. James watched the interaction with a strange feeling in his chest. A longing, perhaps. A longing for the kind of family he had lost. Shaking the thought away, he opened the passenger door for Sarah. She hesitated for only a second before sliding in. James took the wheel. And together, they drove toward the unknown. A forgotten place. The seaside town came into view several hours later, the salty breeze carrying memories of a time long forgotten. James's mind flashed back to childhood summers, the way Chloe had always talked about running away to a place just like this. A town by the ocean, where no one knew her name. The diner from the photograph sat on the edge of the quiet town, its faded neon sign flickering in the daylight. It was the kind of place where time stood still, where people came for coffee and conversation, not for the business of the outside world. James pulled into the empty parking lot, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. What if she was inside? What if she wasn't? Sarah exhaled shakily beside him. This place, it looks like somewhere she would have loved. James nodded, his throat tight. Yeah. He stepped out, nerves he hadn't felt in years creeping up his spine. He had been in courtrooms, high-stakes negotiations, billionaire boardrooms, but nothing compared to this moment. Facing the possibility of finding his sister, as they pushed through the door, a bell jingled overhead. The smell of fresh coffee and maple syrup filled the air. A few locals occupied the booths, but James barely noticed them. His eyes were locked onto the woman behind the counter. She had her back to them, her dark brown hair tied in a low ponytail. She moved with quiet grace, pouring coffee for a customer before wiping her hands on a towel. James's heart stopped. It couldn't be. Sarah's breath hitched beside him. The woman turned, and James's world tilted. Chloe, a brother's desperation. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. She looked older, but still her. The same piercing blue eyes, the same delicate features, but changed. There was weariness in her face, something that life had carved into her over the years. She froze when she saw him. Her eyes widened in shock. Then, fear. James's chest clenched. Chloe. She took a step back. Sarah let out a shaky gasp beside him. It was real. She was real. But Chloe didn't look relieved. She looked like she had seen a ghost. She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. James moved forward instinctively. Chloe, it's me. Her hands gripped the counter like she needed support, like she was ready to run. James, she breathed, her voice laced with something he didn't expect, pain. And then, before he could say another word, she turned and ran. The chase for the truth. James's body reacted before his mind did. He pushed past startled customers and raced after her, his heart hammering in his chest. Chloe, wait. She bolted through the back door, her feet hitting the pavement hard as she ran down the narrow alleyway behind the diner. James wasn't letting her go. Not again. Not this time. Stop, he shouted. Please, just talk to me. But Chloe didn't stop. She ran like she had spent years running. And maybe she had. James's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his expensive dress shoes slipping slightly against the uneven pavement. She darted toward an old wooden pier, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond it. James caught her wrist just as she reached the edge. Chloe, stop. She whipped around, her eyes wild, filled with years of unched pain. Why did you come here? She whispered, her voice raw. James's chest heaved. Because I never stopped looking for you. Her face crumpled. You weren't supposed to find me. James felt like he had been punched in the gut. Why? He demanded. Why, Chloe? Why did you run from me? Tears filled her eyes. Because I was afraid. I was afraid if I came back, he'd find me. I was afraid he'd hurt you. James's voice cracked. He's gone, Chloe. He can't hurt us anymore. She let out a broken sob, years of suffering etched into the sound. James stepped closer, his grip gentle but firm. Please, just come home. Chloe looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she whispered, I don't know if I have a home anymore. James swallowed the lump in his throat. Yes, you do, he said softly. And for the first time in years, hope flickered in Chloe's eyes. The bridge between past and future. James tightened his grip on Chloe's wrist, not to hold her captive, but to anchor her, to remind her that she was no longer alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant cry of seagulls and the waves lapping against the wooden pier. The salty breeze whipped through Chloe's hair, but she barely seemed to notice. She was frozen, staring at James as if he were a ghost. I don't know if I have a home anymore, she had whispered. And James's heart had cracked wide open. His voice, when he finally found it, was gentle but firm. Yes, you do. Chloe's eyes darted away, and she tried to pull her hand free. But James refused to let go. You don't have to run anymore, he said softly. I swear to you, Chloe. He's gone. Dad is gone. Chloe flinched at the mention of him. James, her voice cracked, and for the first time since she had fled the diner, he saw something flicker in her expression. Not fear, but doubt. Doubt that she was safe. Doubt that she was worthy of being found. James stepped closer. I spent years thinking you were dead, Chloe. Do you have any idea what that did to me? His voice shook slightly. I thought I failed you. I thought I let him take you away from me. Chloe's breath hitched. I ran. Because I had to. If I had stayed, he would have destroyed me. James nodded. I know, but you didn't have to do it alone. Chloe swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Sarah appeared at the entrance of the pier, her expression filled with relief and worry. Chloe, she breathed, her voice full of emotion. It's really you. Chloe's eyes darted to her, her expression cracking further. Sarah, you weren't supposed to come looking for me. Sarah stepped forward hesitantly, her gaze soft but unyielding. And yet I did. A choked laugh escaped Chloe's lips, but it was full of pain rather than humor. She rubbed a hand down her face, her fingers trembling. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I don't even know how to do this anymore. James inhaled sharply, his grip on her wrist finally loosening. You don't have to know, he said. Just let us be here. Chloe blinked rapidly, as if fighting back years of suppressed emotion. Sarah took another step forward. Chloe, you're my best friend. You were my family when I had no one. You saved me. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. And now, it's our turn to save you. Something inside Chloe shattered at those words. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Her walls, built over years of fear and survival, began to crumble. She let out a ragged breath, shaking her head as she wiped at her face. I don't deserve this, she whispered. James felt his chest tighten. He reached forward, placing both hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. You deserve everything, Chloe. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be home. She stared at him, her breath uneven. Then, in a move that caught both James and Sarah off guard, she threw her arms around him. James's breath caught, but he reacted instantly, wrapping her in the tightest hug he had ever given. For the first time in almost 20 years, he held his sister. And for the first time in almost 20 years, Chloe let herself be held. She sobbed against his chest, gripping the fabric of his expensive jacket like it was the only thing keeping her upright. James held on tighter. Sarah, tears glistening in her own eyes, placed a hand on Chloe's back, adding her presence to the embrace. They stood there like that, three people bound by love and loss, finally reunited, finally whole. The truth she had feared. After what felt like an eternity, Chloe pulled away. Her face was damp with tears, but for the first time since she had turned around in that diner, there was light in her eyes. James nodded toward the diner in the distance. Let's go inside. Talk properly. Chloe hesitated. I don't know if I can. James tilted his head. Why not? She bit her lip, glancing between him and Sarah. Then, in a soft, almost broken voice, she whispered, Because I haven't been alone all these years. James and Sarah stilled. Chloe exhaled shakily. She ran a hand through her hair, her expression shifting to one of fear and vulnerability. I have a son. James's entire world tilted. His breath caught. Sarah's eyes widened. A son, James repeated, his voice hoarse. Chloe nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if bracing for rejection. His name is Ethan. He's 7. A child. James's mind reeled. His nephew was out there, and he had never even known. Chloe looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. He's my whole world, James, and I was scared that if I came back, if anyone found me, he'd get taken away from me. Sarah stepped forward. By who, Chloe? Your father is gone. Chloe let out a bitter laugh. Not him. She met their eyes. Then she whispered, Ethan's father. James stilled. Sarah gasped. Chloe swallowed hard, her voice trembling. I made a mistake a long time ago. And now, I don't know how to fix it. James's heart pounded. What do you mean? He asked carefully. Chloe's breath shook as she spoke her next words. Ethan's father. He was a bad man, James. And if he finds out I'm back, he won't let me go so easily. James felt a dark rage begin to stir inside him. This wasn't just about finding Chloe anymore. This was about protecting her. Protecting Ethan. James straightened, his jaw tight. Where is he now? Chloe's lips trembled. I don't know, but I know he's looking for me. James exchanged a glance with Sarah, and in that moment, they knew. The past wasn't done with them yet, but this time, James wasn't going to let it win. He had found his sister, and now he was going to make sure no one could take her away again. Not ever. The shadows that follow use. The air around them grew heavier after Chloe's confession. The revelation of her son, Ethan, 7 years old, hidden away from a past she feared would return to haunt her, had changed everything. James felt a storm brewing inside him. He had spent years searching for Chloe, believing she was lost. And now, not only had he found her, but he had discovered she was a mother, that she had spent years living in fear, protecting not just herself, but her child from something. Someone far worse than their past. James exhaled sharply, his hands clenching into fists. Where is he? He asked, his voice low and controlled. Chloe froze. James. Where is Ethan's father? He repeated, more forceful this time. Sarah, standing beside them, sucked in a breath. Chloe, are you in danger? Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, looking at the wooden planks of the pier beneath their feet. The salty wind tugged at her hair, but she barely seemed to notice. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long time, I thought I was safe. But recently, I started feeling like I was being watched. James's stomach twisted. Recently? Chloe nodded, looking over her shoulder toward the quiet town, as if expecting someone to appear out of the mist. I kept my distance. I stayed in places where no one could track me. I never used my real name, never left a trace. She swallowed hard. But 2 weeks ago, someone slipped an envelope under my door. James went rigid. What was inside? Chloe hugged herself tighter. A picture of Ethan, taken from a distance. Someone had been watching us. Sarah gasped. Chloe, why didn't you tell someone? Chloe let out a broken laugh. Who, Sarah? The police. You know how these things work. There was no return address, no fingerprints, no evidence. Just a message scribbled on the back. James stepped closer, his chest tightening. What did it say? Chloe looked up at him, and for the first time, pure terror flickered in her blue eyes. I found you. The word sent an icy chill through James's veins. This wasn't over. This wasn't just about the past. Someone was coming for Chloe. Someone was coming for Ethan. A dangerous past. James forced himself to breathe through the rage rising inside him. He had dealt with powerful men, criminals, corrupt politicians, ruthless businessmen who would destroy entire families for the sake of money. But none of it compared to this. None of it compared to the fury burning inside him now at the thought of someone threatening his sister. Chloe's voice broke through his thoughts. I left Ethan with Mrs. Dawson, she said, her hands trembling as she wiped her damp eyes. She runs a daycare in town. She's a kind woman, but she doesn't know the whole story. I just told her I needed a break. James turned to Sarah. Go to the daycare. Now, get Ethan and bring him somewhere safe. Sarah hesitated. What about you? I need to know who we're dealing with, James said, his voice hard. He looked back at Chloe. Tell me about him. Tell me about Ethan's father. Chloe visibly shrank at the question. But James wasn't backing down. She had been running for too long. Now it was time to face the monster. After a long silence, she finally spoke. His name is Damien Cross. James's blood went cold. He knew that name. Everyone in the business world knew that name. Damien Cross, a powerful, dangerous man who had built an empire through intimidation, bribes, and destruction. A man who thrived in the shadows, controlling entire industries through fear alone. James had seen his name in legal battles, in high-profile corruption cases, but no one had ever been able to take him down. Damien Cross was untouchable, and he was Ethan's father. A war begins. James's entire body tensed. "Tell me everything," he demanded, his voice cold as steel. Chloe looked away. "I was young. I didn't know who he really was back then. He was charming, powerful, and he knew exactly how to make me feel like I needed him." She swallowed, her voice thick with regret. By the time I realized what kind of man he truly was, it was too late. James clenched his jaw. "Did he hurt you?" Chloe flinched, not physically. Not at first. James's rage grew. But he was controlling. Possessive. He didn't love me. He wanted to own me. And when I got pregnant, I knew I couldn't stay. She looked at James then, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I ran. I changed my name, hid Ethan, built a life where no one could trace me back to him. But Damien is powerful, James. If he's found me," her voice cracked, "he won't stop." James's hands tightened into fists. "He's not getting anywhere near you," he said, his voice sharp with unshakable resolve. Chloe's eyes welled with tears. "James, I can't let you get involved in this. Damien is dangerous. You have no idea." James cut her off. "You're my sister. I spent my whole life thinking I lost you. And now you have a son, my nephew." His voice softened, but his expression was deadly serious. "I won't let anyone take him away from you." Chloe broke down. After years of carrying the weight alone, she let it fall. And this time, she wasn't alone. Sarah returned at that moment, breathless. "I got Ethan. He's safe at my house." Chloe's knees nearly buckled. "Oh, thank God." But James wasn't done. "Chloe, listen to me," he said. "If Damien is looking for you, we need to get ahead of him. We need to find out what he knows." Sarah's eyes widened. "How?" James pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "By using the one thing he never saw coming," he said. "Me." The line clicked, and a gruff male voice answered. "Mr. Parker." James's expression darkened. "I need intel. Now." The man on the other end chuckled. "Who are we hunting?" James's eyes turned to steel. "Damien Cross." A silence. Then a whistle. "You just declared war, Parker." James's jaw tightened. "No, I just ended it before it could begin. The fight for family." James Parker stood in the dimly lit corner of his penthouse office, staring out over the city skyline. The weight of the war he had just declared sat heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve was unshakable. Damien Cross was coming, and James was going to end him before he could even get close to Chloe or Ethan. Behind him, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Sarah and Chloe sat on the couch, both visibly shaken. Across from them, James's most trusted private investigator, Ethan Graves, leaned against the desk, flipping through the information he had gathered. James turned from the window. "What do you have for me?" he asked, his tone all business. Ethan Graves, a former intelligence operative who now ran a high-end security firm, tossed a folder onto the table. "Plenty," he said, "and none of it is good." James grabbed the folder, flipping it open. Inside were photographs, financial records, and reports, all tied to Damien Cross. "He's been digging into your sister's whereabouts for months," Ethan continued. "Cross is careful, but I tracked one of his men making calls to various locations, including this town." Chloe stiffened. He knows where I am, she whispered, her voice barely audible. James snapped the folder shut. Not yet, he said. But he's close. Sarah folded her arms. What does he want with Chloe now, after all these years? Ethan sighed. It's not about her anymore. He turned to Chloe. It's about your son. A chill ran down Chloe's spine. Ethan. James clenched his jaw. He's trying to claim his son. Ethan nodded grimly. Cross is planning to file for parental rights. If he gets legal footing, he could drag you into court. Chloe's face went pale. No, he can't. He doesn't even know about Ethan. Ethan shook his head. He does now. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah turned to Chloe. Did you list Damien as Ethan's father on the birth certificate? Chloe's hands trembled as she clasped them together. I didn't want to. But when I gave birth, I was still technically under his name. The doctors, she swallowed hard. They put his name down. James cursed under his breath. That was all Damien Cross needed. A legal foothold. And with his power, he could use the courts to take Ethan away. Chloe buried her face in her hands. What am I supposed to do? If he fights for custody, he'll win. He has money. He has power. James's eyes burned with determination. So do I. Chloe looked up, desperate. But James, I'm not letting him take your son. James's voice was like steel, absolute and unbreakable. Chloe's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, trusting him. Ethan cleared his throat. That's not all. Cross isn't just coming after Ethan legally. He's also preparing a backup plan. James's expression darkened. Meaning? Ethan pulled out another photograph, placing it on the table. It was a surveillance photo of a man standing outside Ethan's daycare. Sarah gasped. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. James snatched the photo. The man was tall, dressed in black, wearing sunglasses, but even through the grainy image, James could see the unmistakable intent behind his presence. They were watching him, James said through clenched teeth. Ethan nodded. Cross has people keeping an eye on your nephew. If Chloe fights back in court, well, let's just say Cross doesn't play fair. The implication was clear. If Damien Cross couldn't take Ethan legally, he'd take him another way. James slammed the folder shut. Enough. The others looked at him, startled by the force of his voice. This ends tonight. Chloe shook her head. James, you can't just. James stepped forward, his expression cold and controlled. We're not waiting for Damien Cross to make his move. I'm going to make mine first. Sarah hesitated. What are you thinking? James pulled out his phone and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a voice answered. Parker. James's voice was deadly calm. I need men. Tonight. A pause. Then the voice chuckled. How many? James's eyes flicked toward Chloe, her trembling hands, her tear-streaked face, the fear she had lived with for years. His gaze darkened. All of them. The counterattack. Night had fallen by the time James's team assembled. Ethan Graves had called in a group of highly trained men, all former military or intelligence operatives. The plan was simple. They weren't going to hide or run. They were going to strike first. Cross's closest associate, a man named Victor Hale, had been tracked to a high-end hotel downtown. James intended to make an example out of him. The interrogation. The room was expensive, but it didn't matter. James kicked the door open, storming inside with Ethan and 2 of his men. Victor Hale, a middle-aged man in a suit, barely had time to react before James grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. You've been watching my family, James growled, his face mere inches from Hale's. Tell me why. Hale smirked. You already know why, Harker. James's fist crashed into his jaw. Hale grunted in pain, his body slumping against the wall. James grabbed him again. Where is Damien Cross? Hale spit blood onto the marble floor. You think you scare him. He laughed bitterly. You're just another rich man who thinks he can control the world. James didn't blink. He punched him again. Hale let out a choked groan, coughing. James leaned in, his voice lethal. I'm not here to play games. You tell me where Damien Cross is, or I'll make sure you never walk again. Hale's breathing turned ragged. He knew James wasn't bluffing. He's already in town, Hale gasped. He's waiting for Chloe to make a move. He wants her to come to him. James's blood ran cold. It was a trap. Damien wasn't chasing Chloe. He was luring her in. And if James hadn't acted first, Chloe might have walked straight into it. James released Hale, letting him collapse onto the floor. Then he turned to Ethan. Find Cross. And when you do, tell him one thing. Ethan smirked. What's that? James's eyes burned with an unrelenting fire. Tell him that he's already lost. The final move. By the time James returned home, Chloe was awake, waiting for him. She looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. Did you find him? James nodded. Damien wanted you to come to him, he said softly. But we're flipping the script. Chloe frowned. What do you mean? James took her hands in his. We're not going to let him control the narrative anymore. He exhaled deeply. Tomorrow, we're leaving this town. We're taking Ethan. And we're going somewhere where Damien Cross will never find you. Chloe's eyes filled with fresh tears. Do you mean that? She whispered. James cupped her face gently. With everything I have. And for the first time in years, Chloe felt safe. Safe in the hands of the only person who had ever fought for her. Her brother, James Parker. The end of the hunt. James Parker had spent years fighting battles in courtrooms, taking down the powerful and corrupt, but nothing had ever been this personal. This wasn't about business. This wasn't about reputation. This was about family. And he was about to do whatever it took to end Damien Cross's hunt once and for all. The final plan. James stood in the dimly lit war room of his penthouse, surrounded by his most trusted allies, Sarah, Chloe, and Ethan Graves. A map of the city was spread out on the table, along with intel on Damien Cross's movements. Ethan Graves pointed to a private estate just outside the city. This is where Cross is staying, he said. It's heavily guarded, but not impenetrable. James nodded, his mind already racing through the different ways to end this. We don't have the luxury of time, he said. Damien is waiting for Chloe to come to him. We need to make our move before he makes his. Chloe crossed her arms, her face unreadable. And what exactly is our move, James? You want me to walk into his trap? James turned to her, his gaze steady. No, I want to turn his trap against him. Sarah frowned. How? James smirked. We give him exactly what he wants, a meeting. Chloe's eyes widened. James. I won't let him hurt you, Chloe, he said firmly. But if we want to end this, we have to make him think he's winning. Ethan leaned forward. I have a team ready. We'll set up an ambush. But you'll have to be in the lion's den first. Chloe, are you up for it? Chloe exhaled shakily. I just want this nightmare to be over. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It will be. Tonight. The showdown. The plan was set. They chose a neutral location, a private club Damien Cross owned in the city. Chloe would go in alone. Damien wouldn't expect anyone else. But James and his men would be waiting in the shadows. The moment Cross made a move, they would end this. Inside the club. Chloe walked into the dimly lit VIP lounge, her heart pounding in her chest. And there he was. Damien Cross. He was sitting in an expensive leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph. You finally came, he said smoothly. I knew you would. Chloe kept her expression blank. I came to tell you to leave us alone. Damien chuckled. Oh, Chloe, you know it's not that simple. He swirled his drink. You stole my son. And now, I'm taking him back. Chloe's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. Ethan is not your possession. Damien's expression darkened. Oh, but he is. He leaned forward. Did you really think I wouldn't find you? That I wouldn't find him? Chloe swallowed hard. I won't let you take him. Damien smirked. And what exactly are you going to do about it? A voice cut through the air. She won't have to do anything. Damien froze. James Parker stepped out from the shadows, his presence commanding the entire room. Damien's smirk faltered. Parker. James strode forward, his eyes burning with lethal intent. You made a mistake coming after my family. Damien leaned back, trying to keep his cool. This isn't your business. James tilted his head. It is now. The doors burst open, and Ethan Graves and his men flooded the room, weapons drawn. Damien's guards instinctively reached for their weapons, only to be met with the cold steel of Ethan's team. Damien's expression finally changed. For the first time, he looked like he had lost. James stepped closer, towering over him. You have two choices, he said. Leave Chloe and Ethan alone, or I will personally destroy everything you have. Damien glared. You think you can threaten me? James smirked. No, I think I can promise you. Damien's jaw tightened. James leaned in closer. If you ever come near Chloe or Ethan again, I will make sure you lose everything. Your money, your empire, your freedom. He paused. Or if you prefer, I can end it right now. Damien stared at him, fury raging in his eyes. But he knew. He had lost. Fine. He finally spat. You win, Parker. James nodded slowly. Good choice. Ethan signaled his men, and within moments, Damien and his guards were escorted out of the building. James turned back to Chloe. It's over. Chloe's legs almost gave out. James caught her, holding her steady. Tears streamed down her face. Thank you, she whispered. James held her tighter. You never have to run again. A new beginning. 1 month later, Chloe, Sarah, and James sat in the backyard of Sarah's home, watching Ethan play in the grass. He was safe. Chloe smiled, her face lighter than James had ever seen it. I never thought I'd have this, she admitted softly. A life without fear. James smiled. You deserve it. She reached out, squeezing his hand. I never got to say it before, but I love you, James. James swallowed hard. For years, he had believed he had lost his sister. Now she was here. And so was Ethan. I love you too, Chloe, he said. And I always will. Chloe wiped her eyes and laughed. Sarah leaned back in her chair. So what now? James smirked. Now, we live. Chloe smiled, finally free. And for the first time, in a long, long time, everything felt right. The past was behind them, and the future was theirs to take.